Ladies and gentlemen, the theme of the next session is World War II. Step back in time and journey through the pages of history in our enlightening panel discussion on World War II. Our panelist, Dr. Robert Lyman, author of A War of Empires, Japan, India, Burma, and Britain, 1941 to 45, will guide us through the complex dynamics of World War II in Asia. Under the able moderation of Dr. Alan Jeffries, this discussion promises to provide fresh perspectives on this pivotal period in global history. Join us for an engaging exploration of the impact, strategies, and untold stories of World War II. Don't miss this opportunity to gain a deeper understanding of one of the most significant events of the 20th century. May I now call our panelist, Dr. Robert Lyman, and moderator, Dr. Alan Jeffries, to come up on the stage.
Good evening. Thanks for coming. Thanks for staying. It's an absolute pleasure to introduce Dr. Robert Lyman, writer and historian, research fellow at the Changing Character of War Centre at Pembroke College at the University of Oxford, after finishing a 20-year career in the British Army in 2001. And Robert's published very widely on the Second World War. He's just had a book out on the interwar British Army, to much acclaim. And we're here today to talk about a war of empires. So Japan, India, Burma, and Britain, 1941 to 45, which came out a couple of years ago, but is now out in paperback. And I can thoroughly recommend it. I read it a few years ago, and it's got extremely good reviews from some great professors and the such, including me.
Even more importantly, it sold very well.
So I just want to kick off this session and just to say, what was your inspiration behind the book, Rob?
Well, first of all, let me thank everyone at the USI for inviting me. I'm only here for a day. I landed last night, or 2 o'clock in the morning, and I'm flying back tonight. But it's always exciting coming to India. I come about 4 times a year. But the best things about coming to India is to talk about the Indian Army, how dramatically successful it was, both militarily and politically in the Second World War, and yet how little you guys know about it. And I've been on a sort of one-man campaign. I know there are people in the audience who have been on campaigns to raise the profile of the First World War. Well, since about 2004, I've been beating the drum about the Second World War. So Alan's question, by the way, I was heavily dependent on parts of the book for Alan's research into the training methodologies of the Indian Army. Really, really critically important if we were to understand how the Indian Army transformed itself in 1943. And there is at least one Australian in the audience today, and my book also demonstrates or reflects the reality that the Australians played a huge part in providing advice and support to the Indian Army, not the British Army, the Indian Army in 1943, sufficient to enable the Indian Army to further develop its jungle training ideas and produce pamphlets accordingly. Anyway, so Alan's question to me is about the inspiration for the book, A War of Empires. The inspiration is primarily that which I've just described to you, trying to explain the nature of India's victory in Burma and in the Far East generally. When we talk about the Far East campaign, it's often colloquially known as the Burma campaign, so forgive me, I'll just talk about the Burma campaign, even though in 1944 the primary battles were fought in India. I'm glad I've got an audience here that recognizes that the Japanese invaded India. Yes, they did in 1944. The number of people, my own students, who've got not the first clue the Japanese invaded India in 1944. It's quite shocking, isn't it? Collective cultural lack of grasp of history. And that really was the primary motivation for me. And maybe what I should do today is just identify some of the things that we've never known or we've forgotten about this really quite remarkable period of Indian history. The first thing I'll do is I'll just pick up that point you made earlier this morning. The war in Burma, the war in the Far East, took place because of China, the greatest irony of all. The war in Burma took place because of an exchange between Churchill and Roosevelt for Britain to support Roosevelt in supporting the Chinese. This was a particular imperative of Roosevelt, and for Roosevelt to support Churchill's Mediterranean strategy. So that exchange took place, and it just so happened that a particular person at the Quebec conference who enabled Britain to be able to come good on its promise to fight in Burma, Ord Wingate, was also there. It's not a rabbit warren I'm going to go down this afternoon, but it was about China. It was also a war which transformed India. Economically, it created the motivation for the rebuilding of India, or the building of manufacturing capability in India that had not previously existed. For a whole series of reasons which I won't go into, most of the manufacturing goods that were used in India were produced not in Britain, a lot of them were, but actually in the 1920s and 30s in America and Canada. Trains, railways, all the steel and so on tended to come from North America. So we had quite a dramatic escalation of the import of goods and equipment, but also the start of manufacturing in India. And by 1945, we had about 10 million people. Remember that the population in India at the time was 300 million. So 10 million of those people were actually working directly for war industries. And as K.S. Nair quite correctly said this morning, there were, at the end of the war, about 2 million men and about 10,000 women under arms in the Indian Armed Forces. But during the period 1939 to 1945, 2.6 million men and women had joined the armed forces. So it was a period of dramatic change. 1943 particularly is the central or the pivotal point in time when this change occurred. It's quite, you will know General Bill Slim's book, From Defeat to Victory, Defeat in 1942 and Victory in 1944. What happened in the middle was the transformation of India economically, the creation of a new industrial base that was able to sustain the very large army that was growing very quickly, but it was also the recruitment from a standing start of about 190,000 men to an army that, as I said, by 1945 had 2 million men in it, and a few women. Not to disparage the women, very, very few women served in the Burma campaign, less than 200. So that's quite extraordinary in itself, and we don't have time to go into all the reasons for it. There's a very good book on it, but actually it's to raise the profile of a dramatic change that people don't particularly understand. What did that change create? That change created an army that virtually on its own won the battles of Imphal and Kohima. And when I say that, I mean stop the Japanese invasion of India, stop Buttigieg Renya's 15th Army in its tracks in the hills at Kohima and around the hills surrounding the Imphal Plain. About 105,000 men in Buttigieg Renya's army. Very few of them got back. About 600 taken prisoner, most of them unable to commit harikari themselves. And then, not only that, but to cross the Chinwin in December 1944, build 550 10-ton barges out of teak trees that they cut down themselves from the forests to cross the Chinwin and cross the Irrawaddy, to carry 2 armored brigades, Sherman tanks and Lee Grant tanks, to fight a very significant battle, one of the most significant battles, land battles of the Second World War around the Irrawaddy and Mektila in 1945. The ability of the Indian Army to grow, to be able to transform itself through training and leadership from a whole series of things from calories upwards. Srinath Raghavan, my friend, isn't here today, but he's written a very good book, India's War, which I do encourage you all to read. Has a whole chapter on how the Indian Army recognized that its new recruits in 1943 weren't taking in enough calories. Most Indians at the time Indian males were eating about or consuming 1,000 calories a day. They needed 3,500. So they introduced chapati breakfasts, first thing in the morning, 5 o'clock, chapati and sugar to get people going. A whole series of dramatic changes, that had a very significant role in creating a new India. Believe it or not, the Indian Army encapsulated a new India. The Indian Army had to recruit from right across the national base for the first time since 1857. And that very large process of recruitment involved recruiting Madrasi and Bengali regiments for the first time since 1857. No, I know there were Bengalis in the army before then, that's fine, that's not my argument. We had Bengali Madrasi regiments for the first time. Fighting in 1944. There's a fabulous story that an Indian memoir I've got of an Indian soldier listening to Bill Slim on the banks of the Chinwin in December 1943, so 3 months before Mutagutchi Renu arrived in India, hearing Bill Slim tell his Madrasi battalion what was going to happen. What was going to happen? What was going to happen was the Japanese were going to arrive, and Slim told them what they were going to do about it. So here was a new battalion, trained up and given the leadership and the equipment it needed, given the plans, given the trust and the confidence of the army commander. How many army commanders do you know who have stood in front of a private Jawan and told them what the plan for defeating the enemy would be? That was Slim's brilliance. He knew how to motivate his men. Now, going back to Alan's book, Revelatory, how did this transformed army, just take this Madrasi battalion as an example, how did they fight on equal terms? How were they able to fight on equal terms with the Japanese in March 1944? Every single soldier recruited from October 1942 onwards underwent 9 months of basic training. 9 months. When I joined the Army, the British Army, as a private soldier in 1981, I did 29 weeks of combat infantry training. 29 weeks. I thought that was long enough. These boys did 9 months, after which they went to a jungle training center in Sorga or elsewhere and did 2 further months of jungle training. 11 months training. The army in 1944 was prepared to fight the Japanese army on equal terms. One of the primary purposes of all this incredible training was to give these young soldiers confidence they could defeat the Japanese Superman, a myth that had permeated the Indian Army in 1942, and the British Army, by the way, in 1942. To the extent that I've got memoirs, Indian Army memoirs, of the fighting at Scraggy around Imphal in July 1944, where Gurkha soldiers admittedly were sitting back saying, these Japani, they're really easy to kill. Why are we worrying about these people? They're easy to kill. So that is reflective of a new army, a new confidence, a new power that was Indian. And this was an Indian battle. Imphal and Kohima was largely an Indian battle. 1945 was an Indian battle. Let me give you some statistics. You could divide 1945 into 2 parts. First, the advance to the Irrawaddy from December 1943 through to February 1944, in which there were 2 British divisions involved, only 2. The 2nd British Division, which had fought with great gallantry at Kohima, but which largely exhausted, and the 36th the British Division, which is also known as the 36th Indian Division for security reasons, which had taken over from the Chindits and the Indore Valley, the railway valley coming down from Mogong and Michenar. When they got to, both of those divisions fought through the Irrawaddy in February and March 1945 and were then stood down. Every single division, brigade division that fought thereafter, admittedly there were British troops, I'll give you the numbers in a moment, involved. All of the divisions that fought thereafter were Indian divisions fighting down to Rangoon. Of this, let me just give you some numbers, just to be able to contextualize this. Forgive me for going on, Alan, but it saves you from asking questions.
Rob, I was just about to say, I've got 7 questions lined up. I think you've answered nearly every single one of them. But carry on.
I was on a roll there, but it's really important for you, the audience, to understand these numbers. So I've mentioned 2.6 million Indians joining the largest volunteer army in the history of humankind. Just think about that. You had a bigger volunteer army than anyone's ever managed to raise. And as K.S. Nair mentioned, Sri Nair mentioned this morning, that's about, in relation to today's population of India, the equivalent of 10 million men and women. Quite a remarkable number, volunteers. By May 1945, so basically by the time the bombs were dropped on Nagasaki and Hiroshima in May, and by the time that Rangoon was taken on the 3rd and 4th of May 1945, Slim had 1.3 million men in the 14th Army. 1.3 million, quite an extraordinary number. Now, of that number, there were 606,000 fighting men, or men in fighting units. So let's just say about half of the troops were in the rear and about half were fighting. Of that 606,000, what percentage do you think were Indian? Just give me a guess from the audience. Give me a number, a percentage. Higher. Yeah, 87. 87. About 3% were Brits, and the remainder were Africans, about the same number of Africans in the fighting forces. So it's really quite extraordinary. We in Britain have forgotten the forgotten army, we've forgotten the war in the Far East, but and we've got reason to do it. We had hardly anyone there. You guys have got no reason to forget it. Burma was recovered in 1945 by largely an Indian army that was built from nothing by Indians and defeated the greatest threat to Indian independence, an independence that had been promised by Britain in 1929, defeated the greatest threat to that independence, that was from Japan, in 1945. That was the army that gave independence to India, not the Indian National Army, but the Indian army, dramatically successful, dramatically effective. And there's someone who's supporting the INA who's right at the back end of the stuff. He's pulled the plug.
You know, I think I might use my thing as moderator and just ask one more question. Well, one thing I want to say, I think the only thing I totally agree with everything you say, Rob, but I would say it's built on the Indian Army of the 1930s as well. I think the real issue, I think, is in the beginning, in the first couple of years of the war, is the expansion of the army, the rapid expansion, and troops are going into battle with no training, recently recruited, and units and formations are being destroyed. But anyway, so I'll get one more question in, and then we'll open it to everybody else. So you've also written about General Bill Slim, an excellent volume, and I just wanted, could you say a few words about Slim's vital role, which in this book you rank alongside Admiral Mountbatten, Commander Southeast Asian Command, and also General Auchinleck, CNC India. And so you just say what about
you want me to say a few words about one of my military heroes and one of India's greatest soldiers. I'll do my best in a short period of time. But just going back to your first point, yes, the 1930s, the period of expansion after 1938 was really, really critical. And that expansion was caused by two men, one of whom was Claude Auchinleck, who realized that to be successful in a coming war, the Indian army needed to be able to fight alongside the British army. Indeed, in my view, in Italy, the Indian army fought better than the British army. And I'm on record on YouTube. You can find me doing a symposium on the Indian army in Italy, the 4th Indian Division. Fought better. I mean, most of its engagements were fought with much more consistency than its British compatriots. And let me also just say, one of my good friends in the UK challenged me a few years ago to qualify to demonstrate the quality of the Indian Army in Burma. And I said, well, you could take the 4th Corps, the 4th Armored Corps, under Frank Messervy, you could take it out of Burma in 1945 and put it in Monty's 21st Army Group in Normandy, and it would have operated better, if not better, than anyone else in Monty's army. It was that good. In a very short space of time, these men had mastered the art of combined arms operations. And if I describe that the advance on Mechila took place with Sherman tanks with the turrets taken off with troops in the back, so armored kangaroos, with Priest self-propelled 105mm American guns, with cab ranks of aircraft above them on 24-hour call-out, available by radio. This was quite extraordinary, really quite extraordinary. Artillery stonks would lead the tanks and the infantry onto positions in a coordinated way that was only open to the imagination of people in India a year before. Okay, let's go back. So the thinking, the imagination about what an army could do in 1938 under the Chatfield Commission, General Chatfield, and Auchinleck is really, really critical to understand what it was able to do in the war. It created the 4th and the 5th Indian Divisions, which were able to deploy in 1940. Okay, so Slim. It couldn't have happened without Slim. There's no doubt about it. Slim was one of those rare geniuses that pop up every now and again that can see the art of the possible. I argue all the time that success or failure in war is largely the product of imagination. Can you imagine what you're able to do? Because if you can't imagine what you're able to do, go home. Don't bother anyone else with your noise. If you can't imagine what the future can look like, and if you can't achieve it, you're no use to anybody. Slim had the imagination to visualize what success could look like in the face of quite remarkable opposition. And the story of Noel Irwin, Slim's battles with Noel Irwin, I've written in a book called The Generals, where I look at a whole bunch of Japanese generals and British generals and compare them, and one American general, Stilwell. Quite shocking. The Japanese basically failed because of their failure of imagination. In the Indian Army, and Slim was an Indian Army officer, he wasn't a British Army officer from 1919, we had a man who had the imagination to visualize what was required to defeat the Japanese in battle. He had a plan, and he worked hard with his best mate, Claude Auchinleck, who was back in June 1943 as CNC India, to make that happen. And with a number of other quite inspiring men, they created a training establishment in India that could bring about victory. So Slim was fundamental to victory. Slim also had that rare art of determining the best way of defeating the enemy. Most soldiers, by genetic disposition, seem to think that the best way of killing an enemy is by defeating him in force. Oh, he's got 10 tanks, I'm going to need 20. He's got 15 aircraft, I'm going to need 30. He's got 2 battalions, I'm going to need 4. With the idea that a force-on-force confrontation is the way to win. I mean, that concept, which unfortunately many soldiers through history, many generals through history have seemed to have adopted with their mother's milk, was anathema to Slim. Slim was one of those rare men, a little bit like Monash perhaps in the First World War, or perhaps Rawlinson in 1918, who were able to see that the purpose of their army was to seek victory, and battle was a way of achieving it. Battle wasn't an end of it in itself. The defeat and the destruction of the enemy wasn't an end in itself, and it wasn't necessarily the purpose of what they were doing. You needed to be able to achieve your strategic objectives. And in Burma, Slim saw that his strategic objective wasn't defeating the Japanese in battle, but it was discombobulating General Kimura, getting behind General Kimura, removing his ability to sustain himself in Mandalay, and cutting off his routes into Thailand. He did it spectacularly at the Battle of Mektila. Relatively small numbers of Japanese were killed, about 80 or 90,000 of them, but the entire Japanese army of nearly 400,000 was no longer able to fight. And that, as Sun Tzu told us 2,500 years ago, is the epitome of soldiering. Win without fighting. Slim was one of those rare men who was able to put that into action. Look, there are lots of other... He had the opportunity in Burma. Slim, he was able to get away with it because no one was breathing down his neck. Well, not many people were, Lees was. But he was a brilliant soldier. When I produced my book on A War of Empires, so I'm Slim's military biographer. I wrote a book called Slim, Master of War in 2004. And when I wrote A War of Empires, I gave it to one of my friends, a chap called Richard Dannett. And Richard had been a general in the British Army. And he rang me up one day and he said, Rob, the biggest mistake you've made is in A War of Empires. He said, I like it, Rob, but you've made a big mistake. And I said, what's that? He said, you haven't emphasized enough the importance of Bill Slim as a general in A War of Empires. You've given the tribute to too many other factors, not least of all the Indian Army. And I said, well, I've actually written that book before, Richard, but actually the important thing for people to understand in this book is how victory in 1945 was a product of an Indian Army creating success for itself and for its own future. It wasn't fighting for the Raj, it wasn't fighting for the British, it was fighting for a sense of what India could be. And that's why I wrote the book. That's the inspiration behind the book. I entirely endorse all those comments made this morning in the question in our previous session about people not understanding how sizably important the Indian Army was to the essence of Indianness in 1945, 46, 47. 1948, success in 1948 was built on the battlefields of Burma. You know that as soldiers. Your countrymen don't. And it's about time you got up and started telling them.
Thanks very much, Rob. And I think that's a really good note to open questions.
I'll repeat the question. So the question is about the importance of leadership, absolutely fundamental. But you know what I would also say? In all the memoirs, there aren't many memoirs of Indian soldiers, but I interviewed 44 Indian soldiers about 20 years ago. The most important factor in success in Burma was small unit leadership. Yes, getting the divisional commanders, corps divisional commanders right, getting the battalion commanders was right. Slim sacked about 6 battalion commanders. 3 he admitted to, but 3 others I found. He sacked a divisional commander. He sacked Black Jack Grover of the 2nd Division. He was pretty ruthless. Jack Grover was a great man, loved by his men. They would follow him anywhere. But he wasn't good enough for Burma. He was too slow at Kohima. Quite remarkable. I have to be very careful when I say that to a British audience, particularly of 2nd Division veterans. But do you know what? It's small unit leadership. It's the ability of the little men, as they used to call themselves, to keep going. George MacDonald Fraser is a good example of a man who was able to describe the power of small unit leadership. The Lance Corporals, the Nikes, the Havildars, being able to keep their men together through some of the most ridiculous terrain and physical challenges. You all know this. But when I tell an audience in the UK, my students, little test I give them, how much rainfall do we get in the UK? Well, the answer is about 34 inches a year. How much rainfall does the Khasi Hills get? Well, between 300 and 500 inches, and most of it comes between May and October. Now think about trying to fight, think about trying to sustain, think about trying to plan in those circumstances. And unless you can do that, you're a waste of time. And this is the big difference between the Indian divisions and the British divisions. Now, I don't take anything away from the 36th or the 2nd Division, but they had not fought in the monsoon before, whereas all the Indian divisions had done so and had trained for it and had done so brilliantly. The 20th Division under Douglas Gracie, when it was raised in April 1942, had been raised at the start of the monsoon. And by the end of the monsoon in October 1942, they all took a bit of a holiday. And Douglas Gracie's instructions to his division, which are available in the Little Heart archives, are fabulous, and the 20th Division history is fantastic because it describes that. I've rambled on a little bit. Small unit leadership, the most important thing.
Professor Lyman, an honor to ask you a question at this wonderful Heritage Festival. You were, in fact, the first person to announce and write and talk about the battles of Kohima and Imphal being the turning points, among the 4 turning points of Second World War. This country has not understood that as yet. It does need to. My question is not about the iron. There's a book out there just now, written by Nicholas Shakespeare about Ian Fleming. I've read the reviews. Apparently it's officially authorized and it's pretty good. My question is about his brother, Peter. What was the role of Peter Fleming and SOE during the Second World War in the Southeast Asian sector, specifically during Burma and any of these reviews?
Oh, basically, what was the role of Peter Fleming in intelligence deception in Southeast Asia?
And also SOE. Alan will answer the first, I'll answer the second.
Yeah, I'll talk a little bit about Peter Fleming because, bizarrely, we were just talking about him just before this panel. So a book's just come out about Peter Fleming. Yeah, so Peter Fleming's his brother. Yeah, and he was the one that was based in India, Peter Fleming. Yeah, so he was involved in deception activities. He was based at GHQ India, and he got a lot, because prior to the war, he'd been like a traveler, an explorer and a traveler. In fact, he was more well known than Ian Fleming at the time. And he was heavily involved in deception in the Burma campaign, and got in trouble himself because he actually went on some of these operations, much to the disgust of his senior officers. So his role has only sort of come to the fore recently. There's been a new biography about Peter Fleming, came out about 2 years ago, and I think that's the first time his role has been written about. I think he did a little bit. There was a memoir, not a memoir, a biography a few years ago, but because the intelligence archive wasn't open, there wasn't much on his role. But yeah, he's a fascinating character, and perhaps should be better known than his very famous brother.
I've got two little observations about secret intelligence. The first was that there was an outstation of Bletchley Park in India, and they were called the W stations. And the product of the W stations was nowhere near as rich as the UK, as Bletchley Park, because the Japanese didn't use their signals traffic for anything other than high-level conversations, most of which were administrative. But there were only two people who had access to that information. One was Bill Slim, and the other was a man, I forget his name, I think it was Winterbottom, who actually arranged it all. Mountbatten didn't have it. Part of the agreement for bringing out the signals intelligence network to India was that they would restrict the information to particular individuals. And that's why Slim knew that Mutaguchi was invading in mid-March. In fact, the date was the 15th. The first Japanese began to move on the 7th. But you also asked a question about SOE. SOE, Special Operations Executive, known as Force 136 in the Far East, was a dramatically important component of victory in 1945, dramatically important. And I would just urge you to look at a book published by a colleague of mine called Richard Duckett called SOE in Burma, which is an astonishing revelation, and it's changed my view completely of SOE. The first thing to understand is that from January 1945, all special operations came under the command of the GOC&C 14th Army, Bill Slim. Before then, there'd been responsibility of 7 or 8 separate organizations, none of whom had coordinated their activities, and frankly was a disaster. And one of Bill Slim's great complaints, of course, was this lack of strategic direction for special forces. There is an accusation often put out there that Bill Slim hated special forces. No, he disliked special force. Special force was the name given to the Chindits. We don't have time to talk about that today. But he was a great fan of special forces, if used in conjunction with conventional operations. And the great success was Operation Character in February and March 1945. And in a nutshell, the Japanese were rushing to get to Toungoo at the top of the Sitan Valley. I'll be there in a month's time. And Slim needed to stop the Japanese withdrawing to Toungoo, because if the Japanese took over Toungoo, they'd be able to stop or block the road to Rangoon, and Slim needed to get to Rangoon before the rains fell in May. So from January onwards, 105 British and Indian officers and soldiers landed by parachute, by Hudson and by Lysander in the Karen Hills, trained up 14,000 with ammunition, trained up 14,000 Karen irregulars, and stopped they killed more Japanese. They killed about 11,000 Japanese, stopped General Kimura getting to Toungoo. Dramatically effective use of guerrilla warfare within the context of conventional operations, and no one knows anything about it. I knew very little about it. Operation Character, really, really important strategically. And one of the lectures I give is called Strategic Effect, and I give examples of operations, military operations, and ask the question, well, what strategic effect was resulted from the investment you made in this operation and that operation and that operation? And by comparison, the Chindits had 0 strategic effect in relation to the investment made in them, whereas Operation Character and SOE, dramatic. 105 British and Indian officers, many from the Assam Rifles and the Assam Regiment, raising the Karen irregulars and stopping the Japanese from getting to Toungoo. Quite an amazing story.
Well, thanks ever so much, Rob. I'm afraid we're going to have to wrap it up there. Perhaps you could ask your question afterwards, Narendra, if you don't mind. I've just been asked to finish up. So, but thank you for coming all this way to come and talk to us. I know you.
I always love talking about the Indian Army and the Burma campaign.
And just want to say thanks very much. That was fascinating.
Well, thank you all for coming.
Thank you all the panelists and the moderators for wonderful sessions. They have truly been very insightful. The two-day festival of celebrating Indian military comes to an end today. With the aim of seeing you all next year, I thank my lovely audience. I, Deepika Dhanda Singh, signing off, your anchor for the event.